really what you have here is a story of fragmentation in all directions. And the most obvious sign of that, of course, is that we are now almost certainly going to have the first three-way coalition at national level in Germany since the 1950s. But for me, one of the interesting things about Germany is that although you do have this very clear fragmentation, that fragmentation has not come at the expense of the centre.
Once nicknamed the Scholzomat for his robotic approach to politics, Olaf Scholz has led the SPD Social Democrats to an unlikely electoral victory on the 26th of September, stunning Germans and outside observers alike. Scholz is now in a strong position to become Germany's next chancellor. But given the rising electoral fragmentation of the German parliament, he would need to rely on a three-party coalition government, dubbed the traffic light coalition, with the red SPD, the yellow liberals of the FDP, and the Greens. Should that coalition go through, Merkel's centre-right CDU will be out of office for the first time since 2005. What does this new political landscape say about where Germany's political mindset is at? To break this down, we have with us a leading foreign correspondent, Tom Nuttall, and the head of the ECFR's Berlin office, Jana Puglierin.
Don't forget, before we go, there's plenty of things you can do to help us. You can do some very easy things such as liking the show, rating the show, reviewing the show, subscribing to the show, sharing the show with a friend. All these kind of really small things help us grow week after week. And if you really want to show your love a bit further, we now have a Patreon account, which should be in the description below, right here in the description below. Right now, it's just a way for us to help us pay for our digital and physical equipment. But if there's enough of you guys supporting us, we will look into having some conversations with you guys, having some special content just for you. So we're kind of putting our toe into the Patreon water, and maybe it'll be the first step to greater things. So, we have with us two experienced observers of German politics. Tom Nuttall, you're the Berlin bureau chief for The Economist, and the former Charlemagne columnist as well. And Jana Puglierin, you're the head of the ECFR's Berlin office, as well as a senior policy fellow. And you used to work as an advisor on defense issues in the German Bundestag, and I'm sure this will be relevant background experience for us later in our conversation. Let's get right into it. I think the main takeaway of this election across international press, but even across Germany, has been the unlikely fight back of the Social Democrats, the centre-left SPD. For a long-term observer of centre-left politics, you would be excused if you're a little depressed because many of its European counterparts have ended up in political graveyards. And the SPD seemed similarly destined to political relegation with the rise of the Green Party. And yet, somewhat despite all odds, the SPD won the election. Tom, how do you explain this comeback? Is it simply some CDU fatigue kicking in? Or are there some kind of larger lessons that other European centre-left parties might be able to draw upon?
I think there might be some lessons, but I don't know if they're necessarily the ones that other left-wing parties would want to hear. I think the sort of the best explanation for this election result, if we're looking at how the Social Democrats performed, is not really a very exciting one, in the sense that the SPD and Olaf Scholz in particular ran an extremely disciplined and well-organized campaign. They basically didn't put a foot wrong, unlike their main opponents in this campaign. They managed to maintain extraordinary internal discipline, because this does remain quite a heterogeneous party with a strong left-wing strain. And for those of us who'd got very used over the years to seeing the wings of this party feud publicly, bitterly, it was quite something to see how they managed to hold it together during the campaign. But the other thing is that I think Olaf Scholz was very lucky in his opponents, and in particular, the SPD's main opponents, the Christian Democratic Union and its sister party from Bavaria, the Christian Social Union, because they, frankly, had an absolute shocker. They had the worst results by a distance in history. Their candidate, Armin Laschet, turned out to be a terrible choice, although I don't think he was the only explanation for the result. And it just fell apart from them. And of course, the SPD's win was a narrow one. It was just sort of 1.6 percentage point. It could have easily gone the other way. So I don't think there are necessarily grand lessons to be drawn from this win for other European social democratic parties. It's just about discipline, holding the line, and try to make sure that you have bad opponents.
Jana, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, just a note of caution, because although I agree that this was a striking comeback, I don't think this is a huge breakthrough for progressive politics in Germany. I mean, it was not a landslide victory. The SPD just got 25.7%, and basically 1/5 of the German chose the party, whereas Gerhard Schröder back then had much stronger numbers. So just some caution that this is not basically the SPD now taking over Germany.
Mm-hmm. So apart from the SPD's rise, what is the general tale of a tape of this election?
Well, I mean, we've mentioned the collapse of the CDU-CSU, but for me, that in a way is the biggest story of this election. Jana just mentioned the high score that the SPD had under Gerhard Schröder a couple of decades ago. And the SPD has been in sort of secular decline ever since, even if they did stage a bit of a comeback this time round. And I think what you're now seeing is that basically the sort of this idea of the big tent People's Party, the SPD was the first victim of the collapse of that idea, and now we're seeing the same thing happen on the centre-right. So really what you have here is a story of fragmentation in all directions. And the most obvious sign of that, of course, is that we are now almost certainly going to have the first three-way coalition at national level in Germany since the 1950s, and that's not going to be easy to put together. But for me, one of the interesting things about Germany that maybe sets it apart from some other European countries is that although you do have this very clear fragmentation and smaller parties like the Greens or the Free Democrats doing a little bit better, that fragmentation has not come at the expense of the centre. So the hard right, the AfD, Alternative for Germany, had a bad result. The hard left, Die Linke, had a terrible result, only just scraped into the Bundestag. And actually, the centre, conceived in its kind of broader sense, including smaller parties, did better than the last election 4 years ago. So the centre is holding, and in fact, even growing, even as it fragments. And that's not necessarily a pattern that you see in other European countries.
And well, precisely on that, unless Jana wants to jump in and on that point, but turning towards the electoral negotiations, the coalition negotiations, can you get us up to speed on where those stand at the moment and what is sort of the realm of possibility, starting with Jana and then turning to Tom?
So after this election, there were basically three possible coalitions. First of all, the so-called traffic light coalition with the SPD in the lead and the Greens and the Liberals joining, and then the Jamaica option with the CDU-CSU in the lead and the same small parties joining. And then there was always this third option to have another grand coalition, although, I think that was not what, or that is not what parties want. It's not the SPD, not the CDU, but it's in the numbers. And I think now what we see now is an experiment, because it's the first time that on national level we will see a three-party coalition of parties that are not used to govern together. I mean, the SPD and the Greens for sure have some track record. But for the FDP and the SPD, it has been a long time that they had been working together on the national level, that they had governed Germany together. So I think it's an experiment, but all of those parties had won votes in this election campaign. And you see slowly emerging a narrative of we want to modernize Germany together. It's our mandate now after 16 years of Merkel to transform the country, to adjust the country, to modernize the country.
Sure. And Tom?
I mean, Sorry, I'm just trying to make sure this. If this is going to be published in 10 days' time, it's a bit tricky. I think we are on course to have a traffic light coalition, which will be sort of left-leaning, but will have this strong dash of yellow, liberal, free democratic influence. And I think that it's an interesting question, though, which way will this go? Because on the one hand, you have the optimistic take, which is that you have the Greens and the Free Democrats who are they do pretty well with young voters, although they disagree on a lot of things. They're both quite comfortable with the narrative of modernization and change on things like bureaucracy and planning procedures and digitalization and so forth. But on the other hand, I think it's quite easy to have a more pessimistic take, which is that these parties, including the Social Democrats who would lead this coalition, disagree on a lot of things. There's a low level of trust between them. That means they will have to nail down fine points of detail in what is likely to be a very long coalition agreement, which is going to reduce the ability of the government to respond flexibly to events and could, in a sort of a worst case scenario, sort of institutionalize or embed paralysis at the heart of government. You're going to have parties controlling ministries that are going to be at odds with each other on everything, particularly on fiscal policy, taxing, spending, and public investment, which is going to be at the top of the to-do list for the next government. So, German Konrad Adenauer, his electoral slogan was always "keine Experimente," no experiments. And what's interesting is that Germany is actually about to embark on quite an interesting and quite a big experiment.
Yeah, but no, Tom has made a very important point because I mean, it's in our political system and in our political culture to always look for compromise because we have these coalition governments. So the Germans, they don't do revolutions or only kind of from time to time, but not very often. And change is very hard to achieve. And especially, I mean, this traffic light coalition now tries to basically rally around one coherent narrative. And Robert Habeck has said it needs to be more than just an alliance of some parties because there's no other option. We need to stand for something, but it's not like when Gerhard Schröder took over the Red-Green coalition and there was kind of a real plan, a project behind it. Kind of they wanted to invent the new left back then, and here kind of this coalition needs to find its purpose now kind of while running the country. And it's an experiment. And I hope that Tom is right with his first assumption that there is a lot of positive things about this.
There's this growing fragmentation of the electorate, obviously, with the two major parties now claiming a much smaller share of the overall vote, 50% down from 80% in 2002. So what do you think that having a fragmented political spectrum says about Germany? Is it a generational fracture that is being shown between the older voters who are primarily voting for the CDU and the SPD, whereas the younger ones are going with the Greens and the Liberals, or what's at play here? What do you think it tells us about the German electorate? Starting with.
I don't know if we are so fragmented because, as Tom has pointed out initially, the center got strengthened and the fringes lost. So I don't know. It's not about polarization or fragmentation. It's about different versions of the center, I think. And what will be hard is to form this three-party coalition, and it is an experiment, but it's working already quite well in some of the German Länder. In Rhineland-Palatinate, we have a traffic light coalition that is, I think, functioning pretty well. In Schleswig-Holstein, we have a Jamaica coalition. So I think we already have some examples that you can have stable and functioning three-party coalitions. And I don't see Germany that fragmented or polarized. I think other neighboring countries doing much worse than we do.
Yeah, the age polarization thing is quite interesting because if you sort of carved up the electorate into different age blocks, then there was a pretty straightforward relationship of the older that you get, the larger the combined vote share for the two traditional people's parties, the Christian Democrats and the Social Democrats. And this is potentially a problem for those bigger parties for sort of obvious morbid reasons. It's not obvious necessarily that people will stick with the voting behavior that they acquire as young adults. But even if some of them do, then I think you can state with a certain degree of confidence that the sort of the future trajectory is for a continuation of this fragmentation. But I think, again, like, I absolutely agree with what Jana said. Fragmentation does not mean, in Germany, it does not necessarily mean polarization. And the perfect thing to do is just to contrast Germany with some of its neighbors. I mean, next year in France, we may well see Emmanuel Macron go up against Marine Le Pen again. Now, that's polarization, and you don't have that sort of thing in Germany. I think one of the questions, though, will be, again, thinking about how a three-party coalition might work. The consensus is absolutely key in Germany, and it means that democracy is very strong and robust, and decisions enjoy a lot of legitimacy. That also has a lot to do with the federal system, where municipalities and states have a big say over lots of things. The question for me, though, is how suitable is a system like that, which is sort of structurally designed not to move quickly? How suitable is that to manage some of the very big challenges that are coming down the line for Germany, both in terms of domestic policy, meeting the needs of the climate transition, the industrial energy transition, the massive demographic challenges, and then I think we're going to talk about it a bit later, but on European level, at a foreign policy level as well. If you have this sort of institutionalized blockage that we were talking about earlier, that might make it a little bit more difficult than we would like to see this next German government take the sort of decisive action that might be needed in some of these areas.
I have a two-finger because I forgot to mention something when it comes to fragmentation, because there actually is one fragmentation that worries me greatly, and this is the East-West divide in Germany. The AfD has overall lost, but it's still going very strong in the former East. In Saxony and Thuringia, it came out first. I mean, not because it gained so many votes, but because the CDU was so weak. But still, I mean, in all the countries, or the Länder, as we say, of the former German East, the AfD is basically polling above 18%. And it's very hard to form coalitions in those countries. We've seen this in the past, especially in Thuringia, because so far nobody wants to enter a coalition with the AfD. But I think this will also be a huge temptation now in the future for the CDU in the East, because there a lot of voices have already expressed sympathies for, I don't know, opening up more towards the AfD or trying to copy their approaches. And this is actually a fragmentation that I thought we had long overcome, but that is actually cementing itself in recent years and not going away in any sense.
Tom, do you have any thoughts on this interesting point about East-West fragmentation?
Yeah, I mean, it is problematic. And I mean, it was interesting in the aftermath of the election, talking to CDU MPs from the East, and in particular, in fact, not to overcomplicate things, but the East itself is fragmented, and it's particularly, as Jana said, it's particularly Saxony and Thuringia, and to an extent Saxony-Anhalt, where you have this strong AfD showing, which is kind of the southern part of the East, and the northern part of the East less so. But talked to CDU MPs from that part of Eastern Germany, and they were so angry with the way that the campaign had been handled, and in particular so angry that they were given, as they saw it, that they had this candidate Armin Laschet foisted onto them, who was completely unable to mobilize support in the East. I think at national level, this isn't necessarily a huge problem, but when you get into some of these state elections, and as Jana said, these coalitions that you have, really, really difficult to form governments now in some of the eastern states. And there is going to be, I think this is a long-term challenge for the CDU in the East that doesn't really have any obvious answer. Because the AfD has now established itself in some places as something not too far away from a people's party that can appeal to broad sections of the population, is deeply embedded in communities. And the CDU is tugged between, on the one hand, the sort of electoral imperative to try to get some of these people back, because they had a devastating election result in the East this time around. And on the other hand, the National Party, based in the Konrad Adenauer House in Berlin, which is saying there can be absolutely no movement towards the AfD whatsoever in the East or anywhere else, because as soon as we do that, then we will absolutely devastate ourselves in the middle and we'll lose voters to the Greens and the SPD and whoever else. And I don't think there's a real strong tension there, and I don't think there's any obvious answer to that, at least in the short term.
That's a good pivot to the CDU. The CDU has taken a severe beating. It dropped 9 points from 2017, but if you go back a little further, It had already dropped 10 points in 2017 from 2013. Now, Merkel remains immensely popular. She's even more popular now that she's not running for anything. But to what extent is she also partly responsible for the party's weakening? Is it simply Armin Laschet's poor handling of the election? And he's now apparently heading out from CDU leadership. But do you think that the CDU will conclude that with this election, it will need to re-energize right-wing voters by pivoting away from Merkel's more centrist reflexes, centrist leanings, and perhaps maybe grant the CSU, the Bavarian sister party, a larger role in the near future? Tom?
I think assuming that they don't somehow rise from the dead and make it into government, I think that the CDU, I think the CDU CSU is headed for very, very choppy waters indeed, because there is no common assessment inside the party of what the hell has gone wrong. And what sort of party they should be in the post-Merkel era. I mean, we've seen that. There's been lots of warnings of this in the last few years, right? Because Merkel stood down as CDU leader 3 years ago, and we've had two leadership elections since then. And in both of them, you had Friedrich Merz, who became a sort of a standard bearer for the right of the party, doing very well, but not quite well enough to win. But he represented the ambitions of a very large part of the party base to do exactly what you just described, which is to make this sort of rightward turn, to rediscover a conservative identity on issues like migration, but also on fiscal policy. But on the other hand, you have another part, probably the larger part, that says we need to maintain the Merkel line because it's extremely electorally potent. The German electorate remains very, very centrist. That is how Merkel was able to do so well. She was able to get votes from places that the CDU had never got votes from before, and that to move away from that would be suicidal. And for what it's worth, I think that they're right in that assessment. If you look at where the CDU lost votes, or CDU-CSU lost votes in this election, they lost them in the center. They lost them particularly amongst elderly voters to the Social Democrats, because Olaf Scholz was so convincing did such a good job at convincing older voters that he was the rightful heir to Angela Merkel. And I think Laschet did have a disastrous campaign, but he wasn't the only reason for he shouldn't be the only scapegoat for this election defeat, because the CDU-CSU has to do has to conduct a much more serious investigation into how it is that it failed to alight on a meaningful post-Merkel identity. And I think it's now going to descend into a pretty bloody fight about exactly what that's going to mean in opposition.
Yeah, and the fight has already started. I think that was breathtaking to watch during this election campaign. The degree of infighting I have not seen in a long time, and not in the CDU-CSU, kind of Söder versus Laschet during the election campaign, then after the election. And I think this will continue because Markus Söder for sure has the ambition to become Germany's next chancellor. I mean, he is basically sees himself in the pole position for this, and I completely agree with Tom. I think it will be very tough for the CDU, especially because not only Armin Laschet has now lost, but previously Annegret Kramp-Karrenbauer as the other person, successor coming from the Merkel camp. And now I see, the Merkelians, the conservatives, the economic liberals, all fighting with each other, and at the same time having a party where nobody knows where it stands for. And that was also a problem during the election campaign. So nobody knows what the CDU's or CSU's ideas are for the future of Germany. And they never, I mean, the union was never famous for its ambitious party programs. It was enough that the party governed. But I think now they really need to reinvent themselves and tell a story. And what Tom said previously about the CDU in the former East, I think this will really be a problem for the party, how to unite it. And if you look at the SPD, and the split of the SPD after Gerhard Schröder, I wouldn't rule out to see something similar now with the CDU-CSU.
And just a footnote, actually, on the CSU in particular. I mean, this might make me sound like a very naive outsider, but it's sort of breathtaking to me that there is not a conversation about a real conversation about how these two parties, which we were reminded, as Jana said in the course of this campaign, that these really are two distinct parties, even if they campaign together, how to make this work better. Because the kind of original sin here was the decision in April to make Laschet the chancellor candidate over Markus Söder, the head of the CSU. And, people can have legitimate disagreements on whether or not that was the right or wrong decision. But what I think is undeniable is that the way in which the decision was taken, which was literally in a back room of the Bundestag, I think in Wolfgang Schäuble's office at midnight in the middle of April, was really not a good look. This is meant to be, this is one of the biggest, most serious political parties in Europe, and it has no established mechanism for determining a candidate when the two constituent parties disagree. So I would have thought that it would be sensible in the sort of the bloodletting that is now about to proceed inside the union, at least to try to come up with a more systematic way of managing these disagreements when they arise, because it was not healthy in April, and if it happens again, and I'm sure it will happen again, it will not be healthy then. I think one thing we know about the German electorate is that they don't like to see disunity inside the party, so they really need to think more clearly about how they go through this process of choosing a candidate next time.
Could it just be that it's a party that's been in government for 16 years, that is exhausted by all the compromises necessary? Maybe the fact traffic light coalition is the most likely option might be a blessing in disguise for the CDU. Maybe they can rebuild an opposition and come back in 4 years a regenerated party. Tom?
We'll see. I'm a bit skeptical about this idea of renewal in opposition. It sort of sounds good. You can go away and lick your wounds, and without the responsibilities of government, you can think about what it is that you stand for and what you don't stand for. And maybe they will be able to do that. But, Jana made the point earlier that this is not really a party that's ever been about sort of ideological visions or having a sort of strong political content. It's a party of power. It's known as the Kanzlerverein, the Chancellor's Club. And I think when they're out of power, they're going to, we were talking about it earlier, but I think they're much more likely to descend into serious infighting about exactly what sort of party they're supposed to be. And what they're ultimately having to contend with is the fact that the old way of doing things, where they could, assume that they could get kind of 35-40% of the vote because they were a people's party that had this broad appeal, those days are gone, and those days are gone, I think, forever. It's not the fault of the party. This is much deeper things to do with the changing nature of society and of economic changes that all of these traditional big tent parties across Europe have had to deal with. But that creates difficult questions for the CDU to answer in opposition. And when it is dealing with the humiliation of being outside of government, when it considers that it has the right to be inside government, I'm not sure it's necessarily going to be in a better place to answer those questions. So, we'll see. If things go terribly wrong for traffic light, which they could do, then the CDU, CSU may be in a very good position to pick up the pieces in 4 years' time. But at the very least, I think that's an open question.
Any thoughts, Jana? Otherwise, we can move to Europe.
No, I was just, when Tom started to talk, I was reminded of a quote from Franz Müntefering, former SPD parliamentarian, who famously said in German, "Opposition ist scheiße," which means opposition is just pure shit. And that's what I thought of when Tom started talking.
Right. Well, shifting gears to the European stage, it seems like Angela Merkel obviously was center stage in European politics for much of her tenure. It seems like Germany was able to wield great influence through her ability to navigate European politics. What do you think is going to happen to Germany's influence on Europe now that she's out? Do you think that a Jamaica or a traffic light coalition is going to mean less European kind of a weight in European affairs, starting with Tom and then Jana?
I don't know what Jana thinks, but my feeling is that actually the rest of Europe is perhaps a little bit more nervous about Angela Merkel's departure than Germans are. And if that's true, then it's not especially difficult to imagine why that might be. You look at all of the the crises that the European Union has had to confront over the last decade, and we'd be here all day if we listed them. But you have one common feature, which is a common thread, which is Angela Merkel sitting at the heart of all of them, negotiating deals, forming strong personal relationships, staying up all night to negotiate with, whether it was inside the club or outside with Vladimir Putin or President Erdogan of Turkey or whatever else it is. And that's going to be gone. And so, it's not a straightforward question. Germany, by dint of its size and its economic heft, is always going to be, as it were, the indispensable European, regardless of who the chancellor is, regardless of what the coalition is. But the gap that Merkel leaves, will, at least in the short term, is not going to be filled by anybody. It's not going to be filled by Olaf Scholz. It's not going to be filled, however much he might like it, by Emmanuel Macron, who does not enjoy the same trust or support in some parts of Europe as Angela Merkel did. So we're going to have, at least at least in the short to medium term, we're going to have a void at the heart of Europe. And that could be tricky because, you do the thought experiment and you think through, what if we were hit by another round of market panic like we had in the Eurozone crisis 10 years ago? What if we had another migration crisis? You're not going to have, it's not about Merkel's sort of political ideas or her particular vision. It's about her method and the way that she went about striking deals and forming these relationships. In the absence of that, I think it's going to be a more fractious place. It's going to be harder to hold the club together. And that could, if crisis strikes, and it may well strike from unexpected places, then it might be a trickier thing to navigate without having somebody like Angela Merkel at the heart of it all.
Yeah, I agree. I tend to wholeheartedly agree with everything. And I think it's important to emphasize that a huge chunk of Germany's power in Europe is structural and not personal, but that, of course, Angela Merkel as a person has made a difference. However, just remember kind of Merkel came into office in 2005, and then shortly afterwards, the continent was hit by the financial crisis, which then developed in a fully fledged crisis in the Eurozone. And so it was Merkel's first term then, and she successfully managed it. So I think also new German chancellors can develop a pretty impressive footprint on the European level early on. And Olaf Scholz is an experienced negotiator. He has been behind the recovery fund together with the French that has been developed not only in the chancellery but in the German finance ministry. So I think he already knows how to negotiate on the European level, and that gives me a lot of hope. Also, the three parties of the traffic light coalition are very pro-European parties. So I think we will see a lot of continuity when it comes to Germany's overall approach. And still, because of geography and because Germany sees itself always as the spider in the web in Europe, the country that brings everybody together, I think this inclusive approach will prevail. However, with one important caveat, or maybe that's more hope that is speaking but I still think that Merkel had a special understanding, a special sympathy for countries in Europe's east, and for some reasons, I think she was never tough enough with Orban and Kaczynski and those forces in Poland and Hungary. And I think here, maybe Germany will be less inclusive in the future, less tolerant vis-a-vis rule of law violations, and more ready maybe to move forward, not with everybody on board. What was Merkel's priority when we negotiated the budget and the recovery fund and the rule of law mechanism, when she really insisted that it's about having Poland and Hungary on board. And I could imagine that a traffic light coalition, because of the Greens, because of the FDP, but also because of the SPD, might be more ready to push harder for those countries to comply with European rule of law standards. But as I said, that is maybe also me being very...
There's definitely an interesting conversation right now in Poland with a constitutional court deciding that to affirm the superiority of the Polish constitution over EU law, but I think that's an entirely different topic, and I'm afraid to open that can of worms, we should probably do an episode on this in the near future, Jorge. But I want to bounce back on what you just said, Jana, on how all three parties in the traffic light are pro-European. I think I agree with that, but I also think there's a different understanding in these parties on what being pro-European is. And I remember back in 2017 when the CDU was trying to build a coalition with the Greens and the FPD. One of the main issues and one of the things that concerned, I remember Emmanuel Macron back then, was that the FPD was very much in opposition to any fiscal integration, to anything that would federalize the European Union too much and essentially ask the German taxpayer to contribute more for the EU. On top of that, there is also going to be tensions about the spending on a European Green Deal between the FPD and the Greens. FDP and the Greens. How do you see these different issues working out? Because we're all assuming here that the traffic light coalition will go through, but if it does, how will these tensions work out in the future, Tom?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a good question, but you have to sort of break it down. It depends on exactly what you're talking about. One of the first things that we know is going to happen at European level next year is going to be a discussion on the Stability and Growth Pact, the set of fiscal rules that determine what sort of deficits governments can run in their debt stocks and so on. And there's a strong appetite in countries like France and Italy for a root and branch reform of these rules. The argument, which is quite a compelling one, in my view, is that these rules were drawn up under completely different macroeconomic circumstances in the 1990s, especially after the pandemic, when countries had to spend a lot to support unemployment insurance schemes and whatever else. They racked up huge debts to do so. We're in a different sort of world now. We also have far lower interest rates than we used to, so those debt burdens are less onerous than they were. But that argument does not really find a lot of support in Germany. And Olaf Scholz, he's a social democratic chancellor, but he signaled on several occasions during the campaign that he thought that the EU's fiscal rules, which were suspended during the pandemic, had shown that they were sufficiently flexible to respond to a crisis and did not need that sort of reform. The FDP, the Liberals, as you were suggesting, this is an absolute red line for them, and they will ensure that that red line is not crossed in coalition negotiations, that you have big changes to those rules. The Greens would like to change them, but my sense is that that is one of the things that the Greens know that they will have to sacrifice in the coalition negotiations. So I don't think, for those countries that might be wanting a big change on that front, I don't think that they're going to find much of an ally in the German government. But on other areas, I mean, Jana already touched upon the rule of law stuff that affects some countries in Central and Eastern Europe. On the sort of broad cluster of topics that falls under the strategic autonomy rubric, which is, in Germany's case, is also partly about how it conceives its relationship with China and with America. There, I think there might be more scope for sort of interesting conversations and progress at European level, and partly because there are less differences between the constituent parties of the German coalition that we all expect to be formed in the next couple of months. So I think it depends on exactly what you're talking about. On the fiscal side, tricky. On some of the other areas, defense, security, strategic autonomy, rule of law, maybe a little bit more scope for advance and progress.
I have an objection on defense. I think that will not go smoothly at all under this coalition, and especially not kind of the French actually will not like what they see coming out of Germany, I think. Because the Greens actually have opposed many of the initiatives that we are applauding in European defense. For example, the European Defense Fund in its current form, the European Peace Facility. So the idea to not only train other partners but also equip them. Greens are highly skeptical because they think there are not enough conditions put on the partners. Then, when it comes to arms exports, the SPD and the Greens have indicated that they want stricter regulations. That makes it hard then to develop something together with, especially France, and to have these joint armament projects that I think we need in order to be more sovereign on the European level. And also, when it comes to military missions. The Greens weren't kind of head over heels, let's say, in the past 4 years. And looking at the performance of the SPD in the Grand Coalition on all things defense related, I'm not so sure that we will see a lot of progress here, or that kind of Germany is very much in sync, especially with France. Also, when it comes to doing missions outside the EU framework, I think this government then would be even more opposed than this current government, or than the CDU, CSU, who where at least some people always were at least flirting with the idea to, I don't know, do more with the French in the Sahel, also outside the EU framework and the UN framework.
I this might sound as a bit like a harsh question for the Germans, but as an outside observer, it seemed to me that first of all, in the main candidate debates, they never or hardly ever discussed foreign policy. I think they discussed it once in the very last debate. I could be wrong, but that was my understanding. It gave me the impression that Germany had not fully grappled with its international status, and it hasn't been thinking in kind of strategic terms of its place in the world. Could it just be that the German electorate isn't interested in foreign policy? Or is there really something missing here? Are we missing something? Are the Germans not thinking more strategically, more critically about their place in the international scene? Jana?
Well, I don't know. I mean, of course, in Germany, every politician says that you cannot win elections on foreign policy, and I think that has been also true in the past, with maybe one exception, when Gerhard Schröder was campaigning on an anti-Iraq war ticket. But but I mean, comparing this to other countries, to the United States, for example, did foreign policy play such a big role in the US election, the last one? Also looking at the French election, Emmanuel Macron might have made it a point to campaign on the EU ticket, but overall, I don't know if we are such an outlier in Germany. I think people are less interested in foreign policy, and I think it's clearly a mistake to not make them more interested and not to talk about it more often, also in the election campaign, because of course. I think if people knew how much foreign policy, or especially EU policy, mattered for their daily lives, they would be more interested. But I think a lot of politicians still think it's very hard to sell in an election campaign.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's completely right. It's obviously right, and it's and exactly as Jana said. I mean, it's not just in Germany that voters don't sort of think strategically about their place in the world. There's hardly any countries, at least in the West, that think about that sort of thing at all. It was a shame that foreign policy didn't play a bit more of a role in the campaign. There was a little bit of talk about Afghanistan because it was impossible to avoid when we had the chaos of the withdrawal. That was about it. There was next to nothing on Europe, nothing substantial anyway. But for me, the problem isn't so much that sort of Germans don't care about strategy or foreign policy. I think the problem is more the way in which the kind of foreign policy elites in Germany are only very, very, very slowly adjusting their sense of Germany's place in the world to these very rapidly changing realities that the country and Europe is confronting. But what that means, though, I think, is that it means that we don't have, as a result, after this election, there's no real mandate to sort of rethink Germany's place in the world because it wasn't discussed and the parties didn't campaign on it. But there are some things that are going to be impossible to avoid in the next few years. I mean, apart from the fact that I think it's a pretty safe bet that there will be one or other crisis at European level that a German chancellor and government will have to play a leading role in managing, which by definition we can't predict now. There are other sort of deeper, more structural things that we can see coming down the line that are also going to be major challenges. For me, I don't know what Jana thinks, but for me, top of the list is the relationship with China. For the last few years, years, it's been possible to detect a sort of subterranean shift in the way, particularly German business or some sectors anyway, are conceiving the relationship as it's got more difficult, as Chinese competitors have climbed up the value chain and started to represent a threat to the German business model, as the kind of burgeoning American-Chinese competition has taken on dimensions that go way beyond the military into things like trade and technology, things that Germany cannot hope to stay out of even if it wants to. So I think there's a growing sense from the people who pay attention to this sort of stuff that the German relationship with China, and to an extent the European relationship with China, is going to have to be recalibrated in many, many different ways. And that's going to be a slow-moving process. A lot of the time it's going to be sort of below the radar, but it's going to be a big thing for the next German chancellor to think about. Angela Merkel, of course, pursued this path of engagement first throughout her chancellorship. I think she was sort of fascinated by China's rise and wanted to try to figure out a way in which it could be managed and brought into the multilateral system. Under Xi Jinping, that's looking increasingly difficult, and I think the next German government is going to have to rethink that approach. And what's crucial is that it might want to stay out of that discussion, but that discussion is coming for Germany. It's not going to be possible for the next German government to stay out of it.
Just a little two-finger, because I think Tom is absolutely right here. I think for Germany, with our small and medium enterprises and also the big companies relying so much on export, this whole crisis of globalization, kind of this growing power competition between the US and China is really putting our whole business model into question and in danger. And that's why I think politicians will need to care about this and take a stance, because our mercantilistic approach, we trade with the world and kind of compartmentalize basically security policy and trade and everything will not work any longer.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Jana, for joys of recording online. I just wanted to recommend our listeners go to our episode 14, where we had Reinhard Bütikofer on the CAI agreement, in which he talked a lot about Germany's relationship with China. It was a very interesting conversation. And if you want to continue a conversation on China and Germany, I think that's a good place to head to. We will also be having an episode on Merkelism with two journalists and authors in the next few weeks. So stay tuned to that. I'm sorry we didn't get to talk about Merkelism that much in this episode, but we will do a follow-up episode on Merkelism in the near future. Thanks a lot, Tom. Thanks a lot, Jana, for this debrief of the German elections and all the very fun speculation on the coalitions. Although, to be honest, I think we all agree that the traffic light coalition will be going ahead, and we all look very foolish in 2 weeks' time if it doesn't, but fingers crossed.
We'll come back and re-record it.
Yes, absolutely. Thanks a lot to both of you, and to all our listeners. See you next week.
Well, so Tom Nuttall and Jana Puglierin are out of the green room. What did you think of this episode on the German federal elections, Francois?
I was really happy I was able to do it. It was a very lively episode. There was a lot of back and forth between the both of them. A few good jokes here and there. I want to start back on the SPD where we started. Because, as I said in my question, the landscape for centre-left parties is a little bleak currently. And Tom said, I don't think there's that many lessons to be drawn because it was a very well-marshaled campaign, very disciplined campaign in which he benefited from kind of CDU tiredness, from fact Armin Laschet didn't run a very good campaign, yada, yada, yada. And I think despite my yada, 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 I think that these are good points. But what I find it interesting is his notion, the fact he put the concept of respect at the very heart of his campaign seems to have struck a chord within the German electorate and maybe with a larger centre-left electorate in Europe. And the reason I'm saying this is maybe Tom is right and there shouldn't be any lessons drawn from this election. But I was really interested in seeing that Anne Hidalgo, the likely centre-left candidate, if she ends up running, or she might actually have to support the Green candidate. But anyways, as of now, the socialist candidate would be Anne Hidalgo. And Anne Hidalgo has been using the notion of respect a lot these past few days. I don't think anyone has made the parallel of what's happening in Germany. But I think when you're a historically large centre-left party, you are desperate for any kind of good news. And I think for many centre-left parties across Europe, what happened is good news, and so they'll be trying to draw any lessons they can.
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, we even have an episode in the pipeline on progressive politics in the EU, and I think progressive parties are largely going to be looking up to Olaf Scholz and what he did to pull off his relative success. I mean, this is still a very fragmented spectrum, and I think that both of our guests kind of drove the point home that this is. I was really interested, for my part, on what the election tells us about Germany, and you had a really good question there, which I asked, but you'd read it up, and which is about the generational gap, right? It seems like older voters in Germany are overwhelmingly supporting legacy parties, traditional parties. I think Tom Nuttall called them people's parties, which I think is very telling. The fact that other parties, such as the Liberals and the Greens, are not people's parties, they're sectional parties. They appeal to people who are environmentally conscious or people who are liberal-minded. They don't appeal necessarily, as the Christian Democrats do and the Social Democrats do, to the German election at large. I think that's what I took. That's what I took his comment to mean. But I was really interested in this generational fracture. I mean, the Liberals and the Greens, and I would perhaps even lump in the left, the Die Linke, although I know they have some older electoral base there as well, so perhaps not them. But the Liberals and the Greens are youngish parties, whereas the Social Democrats and the Christian Democrats are older parties. So I think that's a very interesting fracture. I wish they delved deeper into it.
Yeah, it seems to suggest, as Tom said, in a kind of very morbid way, but that not polarization, but the fragmentation of the landscape into different parties, the Dutchization of the landscape of the parties is going to be very interesting. But there's a joke in Dutch media where the Germans were complaining that the political system was becoming fragmented into smaller parties, and the Dutch are kind of laughing it off because there's like five parties, and the Dutch are kind of laughing because 5 parties is a government coalition. It's not the entire parliament. So there's a bit of there's an evolution here, but I think more generally, to a large extent, EU politics is about building coalitions with people with very different interests and very different backgrounds. And I think that's partly why Merkel was so successful, is because she has this experience of German politics of having to build coalitions with very different people from the center-left, people from the center, people from the east, the west of Germany. And that made her a lot stronger. And I think perhaps that's why we're seeing countries like France, where you don't need to build coalitions, where a president tends to be a little frustrated with EU politics, because they do not have this kind of culture of making those small coalitions, taking the time, making compromises. And I'm not saying one system is better than the other, but perhaps on the European scale, this kind of experience of parliamentarian guerrilla of coalition building, it might be more useful. And I think the one president who I thought was overwhelmingly a failure, but had one forte in European negotiations, was François Hollande. François Hollande had this experience not through the French political system per se, but through the political system of the Socialist Party, where his entire life as the first secretary, le premier secrétaire of the Socialist Party, he had to build coalitions with people who hated their guts. He had to build coalitions with centrists and Jean-Luc Mélenchon back when he was in the Socialist Party. And so I wasn't surprised to see him thrive in those very long negotiations over the fate of Greece back a few years ago, where he would always try to kind of reach a compromise, because this wasn't the French political culture, but it was a French socialist political culture that allowed him to rise to the occasion. That said, I thought Hollande was a pretty mediocre president, but that might have been his one saving grace.
Yeah, and I think going back to your point about the German system, one thing that I take away from this conversation is that it's a system that places a high onus on consensus, right? It essentially requires large majorities for decisions to pass through, whether in the coalitional phase, right, of forming a government, or in terms of passing legislation. The German system is one that requires large electoral support and large majorities in order to get stuff done. And I think what that does to the system is that it lends great legitimacy to whatever outcomes the system produces, because whatever bill or legislation passes or a coalition is sworn into office, it is carried with it a large level of support. So it lends legitimacy to the system at the cost of making it more troublesome to pull these coalitions together and to pass these bills. So it's, again, I as you said, other European countries don't have this culture of consensus. I mean, in Spain, for instance, has had minority governments. They have the current coalition government is a center left and far left coalition government, but relatively to the German system, I'm not sure that they would have been able to govern on the number of parliamentary seats they now have. It's a totally different system, and again, I think the German political psyche is also attuned to this need for consensus building. I think the Germans themselves think of their politics as requiring consensus, so they're bound to support coalitions of a great many different parties. I don't see a lot of people in Germany saying, no, I wish that my party didn't go into a coalition with the other. I don't see that a lot of Christian Democrats think that about the Social Democrats, or the other way around, because everyone is sort of attuned to the need for consensus.
I was also staggered to see the different nature of the election in Germany and the election that's currently happening in France, where the topics covered in both of these elections seem to be completely different. France's election right now, we will do an episode on Eric Zemmour, but it's largely focused on identity, immigration, Islam, which had been major issues in the 2017 elections, but simply completely faded away. And we barely talked about the AfD in this episode, which is really a sign of how the election went. I'm not sure if the 2017 election was a fluke, or maybe the 2021 election is a fluke, but it's very interesting to see the kind of contrast in France and in Germany. And on that note, we can wrap this up. If you've been following to our last few episodes, you probably know what the next episodes will be, because we've been spoiling them pretty much non-stop. So I'm not going to tell you what next week is, but you might be able to guess. Don't forget, before we go, there's plenty of things you can do to help us. Every bit of help really is very much welcome, and really helps us push that much further. You can do some very easy things, such as liking the show, rating the show, reviewing the show, subscribing to the show, sharing the show with a friend. All these kind of really small things help us grow week after week. And if you really want to show your love a bit further, we now have a Patreon account, which should be in the description below, right here in the description below. And right now, it's just a way for us to help us pay for our digital and physical equipment. But if there's enough of you guys supporting us, well, maybe we will look into having some conversations with you guys, having some special content just for you. So we're kind of putting our toe into the Patreon water, and maybe it'll be the first step to greater things. Anyways, thank you so much to all of you. And as always, see you next week.